Jared Schulman, CEO of Daylit. I've been following, maybe like you, this kind of crazy story with First Brands Group. We're calling it the world's smallest SMB. It's actually a crazy story. The owner of the business, this guy Patrick James, he owned 100% of this business. It was doing 1.3 billion in EBITDA, and the whole thing just came crashing down. Really interesting story. And so I've had people reach out and say, hey, do you know anything about this? Can you tell me about it? And so I read through what the lawyers wrote. Now, this is the lawyers of First Brands Group, so we're going to take everything they say with a little grain of salt, but I think I understand exactly what happened. So let me break it down for you. We'll zoom in. So for starters, let's just get a very basic lay of the land of this company. First Brands Group, they're selling third-party parts, and so these are car parts. Basically, if you have a Honda and you want to buy new brake pads, you can buy them directly from Honda, the OEM, or you can buy them from a group like First Brand Group. They're basically like Tommy Boy. They're selling third-party parts, and they're cheaper. They're usually coming from overseas. It's a global supply chain. Hint, hint, wink, wink. We'll see how tariffs and this sort of thing come into play. But it's a really, actually, super big company. And again, it's 100% owned by this one person. And they fueled that growth in a really short fashion. It's a business that's about like 15 years old. They now have 25 different brands, 15 acquisitions in the last 15 years, and they fueled all of that by debt. Now, their debt structure is really kind of complicated, so I broke it down right here. You have these first party, and you actually have second party or second lien term loans, and those are basically, these term loans are basically secured by the equity of the business, intangible assets, any sort of equipment that they might have, or real estate or investment portfolio. These are, classic term loans that are basically fueling, little spoiler, some of this acquisitive strategy. But they also have a very complex lending structure across the world, and it looks something kind of like this. So the way that the business works is they acquire these raw materials, and they actually use a lender to do that. They have a lender that will acquire these raw materials, kind of like an inventory finance group, and that group will then sell, once the processes are already finalized, once they turn those raw materials into actual inventory, they'll sell that into a facility that's controlled by another lender. In this case, it's basically, you can think of it as Bank of America. And Bank of America has the collateral in the inventory as well as collateral in the accounts receivable. And so this lender, Bank of America in this case, accounts receivable and the inventory, which is sold through some other entity that buys raw materials. And then you see right here, they have these accounts receivable assets, which are actually also sold to a factoring company. And so just to make even more of a complex transaction, you have these first and second lien term loans that are fueling the acquisition. You have lenders that are buying raw materials, they're taking those raw materials, they're turning them into inventory, they're selling them into this structure that is secured by the finished goods and accounts receivable. Then you have this other accounts receivable facility that's sold to a factoring company. So a really very complex corporate structure, but you can see it's fueled by a lot of debt. And so really interesting, but at least on paper for the first 15 years of the business, very successful. This business is doing about 1.3 billion in EBITDA. Now it does have a 900 million debt service, and so a highly levered business. I think it was doing something like 6 to 6.5 billion in debt. And everything was going okay. The business is growing, it's hyper scaling. And then a challenge came in, and this was around April, May. They started to miss a debt payment. It was a function of two things. One, these acquisitions are sometimes very complex. They can take a long time to really materialize. And so, as the lawyer writes, there were extra charges that weren't anticipating. They had to start a whole new inventory program for a new acquisition. that was getting expensive. That was about a tune of, about 400 million. And then of course you have tariffs, and this business relies almost totally on a global supply chain. Tariffs were a huge strain on this business, and all of a sudden this business that's cash flowing about 1.3 billion and paying about 900 million in debt, you see this line right here, that flip-flops a little bit, and when it flip-flops, it gets really scary for this business, and all of a sudden they're missing these loan payments, and their EBITDA drops, and that debt service is still at 900 billion. And so what happens, we see right here, First Brands, they call their friends at Jefferies, and Jefferies, if we come back over here, Jefferies was really helpful. They're a partner of this company. They help them arrange all these different loan structures. Jefferies is an investment bank that is I would say expert in slightly riskier debt transactions. And so they call up Jefferies to say, hey, we want to do this global refinance of our entire debt structure. We have 6.2 billion in debt. We want it to fall under one roof. And Jefferies says, okay, we're going to go in, we're going to take a look. And as part of that, they want to do something called a quality of earnings, a Q of E. And as they're digging in a little bit deeper, they see this big red flag. And that red flag is ultimately what ended up costing First Brands Group their position in the market, their call it ongoing concern. Basically what Jefferies found, and we'll come to it, is that this business was over-levered, for one thing, but they were likely, and it's it's not final until it comes out for sure, but they were likely double selling these accounts receivable invoices to a factoring company. So here's how we learn that. Well, Bank of America. So actually, maybe just one quick step back. This is now in May. They start to miss loan payments, and we mentioned that before. But they start to miss loan payments, and this is on like the first. This is like the first lien, and there's also the sidecar. Gets confusing, and so they're missing these loan payments in May, in June, in July, and this is really where they're, hey, red flag. We got to call Jefferies. And then all of a sudden, it's July, August, and September, and Bank of America starts putting the screws to these guys. They're missing payments from Bank of America. Bank of America is not going to be messing around. And so what Bank of America does is they require First Brands Group to start putting more collateral. They have to put more cash, inventory, and then ultimately all of these invoices in their AR into this into the collateral for Bank of America's first lien position. At around this time, this is on September 4th, they also get a letter from Congress saying, hey, you're messing around with tariffs. They're trying to evade some import of goods from China. And so things are really kind of hitting the fan for them. And it finally comes out, their factor company, this is called Raistone, sends a letter to inquire about the position of their collateral, which is something like 2.3 billion of accounts receivable, and First Brands Group basically says, they basically say, look, you either have it, we already gave it to you, or it may have been double sold, double pledged. Double pledged means 2x pledge. It basically, and I shouldn't laugh about it, basically is a very serious thing where the business takes an invoice and they sell it to one entity, and then they sell it to another entity, and so this company was basically getting about an extra $2 billion for this collateral. Now, how did that happen? Like, how does that all make sense? Like, how do they get away with that? For starters, number one, when you're acquiring all of these businesses, it's really expensive and it's really confusing. There's a huge, massive corporate structure. You can imagine each one of these businesses plus all of these entities. These are lending entities, these are inventory managed entities. It's really complex, and so auditors find it really hard to verify all the assets on these entities. And clearly, this is, again, the world's smallest SMB. This is not this isn't Ford or GM. They don't have the same sophisticated accounting firm, and this is no disrespect to the accountants, but the same level of auditing on this very complex structure. And so, for starters, that's one thing. And the other thing is, this acquisition strategy is super expensive. And for our founder here, Patrick, to retain 100% equity of ownership stake of the business, it's really tough to do that. And so likely what happened is they used the AR, they 2x the leverage on the AR, they used that extra $2 billion as part of the acquisition, and they must have thought that they could eventually outgrow it. They could just grow into the free cash flow to start to pay these things back. Unfortunately, that obviously didn't happen. Like any sort of, I don't want to call this a Ponzi scheme, but any sort of over-levered bank run situation, all it takes is just a little bit of a squeeze, and in this case, that little bit of squeeze was right here. You have the tariffs and all these acquisition costs adding up at exactly the wrong time. Costs are going up, EBITDA is going down, and ultimately this business has filed for Chapter 11. They brought in Lazard to manage the process going forward. They brought in a firm a legal firm and a restructuring firm to try and save it, but it doesn't look good. If you're that factoring company that saw these double pledge assets, if you're there was another group, another lender that looked like they had some of their assets, these inventory assets, double pledged. It's not really looking good for this company. It wouldn't surprise me if this thing has to wind down and sell for parts, no pun intended. But this is what's happening with First Brands Group. I'll keep everyone updated on the story. It's really fascinating. If you have any questions, just toss in a DM. Okay, goodbye.